Rory Sutherland, thanks for being back here again.
Ah, it's a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Since we last spoke, you've become somewhat of a TikTok star. Tell me about that.
Completely accidental in the sense that I did a lot of podcast appearances. I basically say yes to a lot of podcasts, and my argument is very simple. Whether the audience is 100 or a million, spending half an hour talking to 100 or a million people simultaneously is mostly a better use of your time than speaking to people one at a time. I think, if you can amplify what you have to say and you get a chance to do so, do it. And over the years, from early kind of recorded TED talks, going back to the, I suppose 2009, 2008, that kind of period, there's a lot of me out there. And guy called, actually a guy called Toby, started just taking clips. He sort of effectively took clips of various things I've said over the last 10 years and TikTokified them. By the way, I'm not complaining about this at all. He did it entirely off his own bat. It was something that, it never really occurred to me as a 58-year-old man that I had a future on TikTok. And it was one of those perfect examples of what I talk about, which is you should actually test mad things because they work surprisingly often, and when they work surprisingly well. And so the first I really knew about it, apart from my children saying, "Dad, you're a fat 58-year-old man, what the hell are you doing on TikTok?" The next I knew, I was occasionally being mobbed by school children. It was most bizarre. Only today, my dentist said, "Don't I know you?" I mean, new dentist, I've never met him before. And he said, "Don't I know you from somewhere? I'm sure you seem familiar." Sure enough, same thing. And the reach of TikTok is genuinely extraordinary. I mean, it is absolutely on a scale that it's hard to envisage. But no, I think what's very interesting, and is that the what you might call the indiscriminate reach of TikTok is extraordinary in the sense that obviously the views I might have on YouTube are basically people who are already interested in what I'm talking about to some extent, and they're therefore self-selecting and fairly homogeneous. Whereas this is a completely new audience, and all the more welcome for it, I suppose, even though it was never part of my intention.
It was a bit of a shameless segue to ask you about you on TikTok, as interesting as it is, because it feels like something else that's blown up on TikTok over the past few years is this kind of alpha self-improvement content, right? Everybody wants to life hack, red light therapy, ice bath their way to being the most self-actualized person, but not a great deal of that content is useful, not a great deal of it is practical. So I thought it'd be fun today to try and apply a behavioural science layer over some of this to work out how we can actually optimize our lives in a way that is based in science and isn't nonsense. But before we do that, where do you think that this seemingly newfound desire for all of us to optimize or hyper optimize our lives has come from?
I mean, I don't quite know, because anybody who, like me, kind of grew up in the 70s and 80s finds it very, very strange in the sense that in the 80s you kind of optimized your life for fun. There was a heavy dose of crass materialism, etc. But generally, people were out to actually enjoy themselves. And there's an element to this which appears to me, and I suppose to a large number of people in my cohort, as almost a form of sort of new Puritanism, in a way. It's sort of, self-denial, self-improvement. And by the way, there's a lot to be said for self-improvement. When it turns into optimization, I think you have to be very careful about it because generally, as Plato would have said, any virtue pursued to excess becomes a vice. There's another wonderful quote from, I think, another philosopher, modern philosopher, who says that vice always arrives disguised as virtue, no exceptions. And it's a point worth making that when you add a numerical value to something, okay, it does create a kind of distortion. Counting your steps, etc. And maybe those things aren't actually designed really to be enumerated. I mean, for most of our evolutionary history, we didn't have a kind of, a kind of numerical value attached to certain parts of our life. Calorific values, whatever it may be. We ate when we were hungry, we drank when we were thirsty. I think, people who were given the idea that, you have to keep hydrated would have viewed it as very bizarre. And so it is very, very good, by the way, if you have a blood test, to keep all those vital signs within an acceptable range, or at least not far outside it. It's very, very good for your good cholesterol to exceed your bad cholesterol. But if you start pursuing that religiously to the point of kind of insanity, you end up with a kind of thing which I think you might call hyper-competition. And the way I describe hyper-competition is any example where the price you pay to win ultimately exceeds the value of the prize. And you could call that, law of diminishing returns. And I think life has become, perhaps ease of comparison is another way of talking about this. We are much, much more likely to compare ourselves to other people, to compare ourselves against target values than we would have been before. And certainly 500 years ago, almost certainly, 20, 30 years ago. And a lot of it actually is great. I mean, it's very, very good that occasionally, someone tells me this slight oddity has shown up on your blood test and you need to do something about it. And that's very, very important, I think. However, the optimization thing, you could take it as bodybuilding in one way, fanatical jogging in another. You are running up against the law of diminishing returns there. And actually, you start to notice actually health problems being created among people whose pursuit of health is perhaps, excessive. Now, I mean, it's complicated, but what I would say is that, most things effectively, wealth would be another one, by the way, subject to diminishing returns. Okay, there are diminishing marginal returns to wealth. It is quite important, I think, to happiness, for God's sake, try and earn, either median income or above and maybe a reasonable multiplier of it. But all the evidence shows that actually, yes, wealth does continue to bring some degree of happiness, but the line becomes asymptotic and pretty flat pretty soon. It's actually not a bad argument for the redistribution of wealth, by the way. That simply the same money in the hands of someone else could be used both more productively, but to generate far more happiness. I have to, even though I'm on the sort of political right of centre, I kind of accept that argument to a large part, provided you preserve basic incentives, I think. So, one of the things I would say is that the overly energetic pursuit of one thing will, if you're not very, very careful, cause you to neglect other equally important things. I mean, the number of sort of very, very successful business people I can think of who basically screwed up their marriages or their relationship with their children in pursuit of the next deal, for example. Ultimately, I think keeping things a bit blurry, not necessarily quantifying everything obsessively, is probably a more balanced way to live in some respects. I think a lot of things, basically, I think, like most things, they start off good and then they become silly. I mean, I was saying today, I was writing a piece for The Spectator today where I said that a lot of technology is like having kids backwards, by which I mean is when you have children, they're a pain in the arse to begin with, but 15, 20 years later, they actually become useful and entertaining, particularly if they learn to drive and can occasionally pick you up from places. Okay? A lot of technology is the opposite. It arrives and it's useful and entertaining, but then 15 years later, it becomes a pain in the arse. In other words, technology often arrives as an option, and then it gradually transmogrifies into an obligation. In the early days, very simple, very sort of trivial example, in the early days of parking apps, we went, oh, great, I haven't got any coins, so I can use the app instead, or, whatever it may be, I haven't got £5 coins, so thankfully I can pay by app. What a useful alternative. And then the finance people come in and they basically remove the coin machine, so you're obligated to pay by app. And then you find yourself in a car park that's 3 stories underground, and the finance person has still got rid of the coin machine, and you're still obliged to pay by app, even though there's no effing signal. Okay? And so quite often what happens when a technology becomes universal is that its use goes from being optional to being assumed. And at that point, it's become an obligation or an imposition. And the benefits it originally offered, when it was a convenient alternative, suddenly go because it becomes the only possible thing. And I think we have to be generally wary of what you might call those fur-lined traps, things that start off highly appealing because they're novel, interesting, and convenient, and then finally we discover that actually, no, you can't have your bank statement on paper anymore. I'm going to defend Luddites for this because I think a lot of Luddites are excessively cynical perhaps at the beginning, but in the longer or medium term, it's always worth remembering they may have a point.
There's an interesting point you made there about the trap we fall into when we try to quantify everything, a very timely one actually. So I wear this thing on my wrist, a Whoop, which records my sleep and my activity, and then it uses some sort of algorithm to determine how well recovered I am on any given day. And normally it's in the green, it's fine, I feel good. The app tells me I feel good, fantastic, I feel good. Today, I have this podcast recording with you. I'm like, I need to be sharp. I need to be switched on. I made the mistake of doing 3 runs over the weekend and then got shit sleep last night. It's telling me I'm on 23% recovered and my heart rate variability is low. And it's basically saying you're going to have a shit day. The app is telling me, it's setting my expectation to say, don't do anything today, don't move, don't think. It's not good. And there's this interesting placebo which happens because before, if I'd slept 5 hours and went for a run yesterday, I'd be like, oh, I feel a bit groggy today. This morning I woke up and I'm like, shit, this is a real problem. I've got this podcast and the app's telling me that quantifiably I'm not going to perform. And I think there's something in that idea that...
It could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, after all.
Exactly that, exactly.
No, and it's complicated because I think... it's always worth noting that there are always very important things in any organic or complex system which can't be easily quantified. So, I've always made this point with things like transport, the psychology of transport. We have measures for speed and capacity and time and punctuality, but we don't have measures for human emotions like uncertainty. And quite often we'd be better off optimizing for the human emotional measure, but we don't, so we optimize for the proxy, what you might call objective measure instead. And don't get me wrong, I make this point all the time, that it's good that trains no longer go at 40 miles an hour. That's good. Because if a train goes at 80 miles an hour, a 1-hour journey now takes half an hour, a 2-hour journey now takes an hour. That's pretty good. If you make the train go at 160 miles an hour, it's extremely expensive to do. It's arguably environmentally damaging and it's dangerous, and the train can't stop very frequently. And now you've only saved half an hour by doubling the speed of the train. Previously you saved an hour. And increasingly those time savings become more and more detached from what humans really care about. Now, the example I always give is the French built a high-speed railway between Paris and Lyon, one capital city, one very major city. The previous journey time was 4 hours. They reduced it to 2. That's a game changer, okay, because you can now go to Lyon and back in a day, for example. You wouldn't choose to fly, for example, once it's down to 2 hours. Reducing that to an hour and a half or even an hour is exponentially more costly in all kinds of ways, but the actual benefit it brings is utterly trivial now. No one ever says, oh, I would go to Lyon today, but it takes half an hour too long. It doesn't really reduce the fact that a trip to Lyon is going to take a day out of your life. Okay, and to be honest, it's worth noting that the time on the train can be made enjoyable and useful for a lot less money than it takes to make the train faster. And so what I'm saying is that over-optimization of things, what tends to happen is if you construct a model, any kind of model, which optimizes for 4 or 5 variables, you will start off with generally beneficial results, by the way. What will happen over time if you don't switch your metrics or reinvent the model is you will become over-optimized along the lines of the things you measure at the expense of things you can't measure. And one of the things you can't measure, let's say, is uncertainty or annoyance. Okay. Now, one of the things I'd like them to do when I go to Manchester is not to spend 120 billion pounds building a faster railway. It's just tell me the platform number 10 minutes early so I can sit on the train waiting for it to leave and get my laptop out instead of standing around the forecourt in Euston feeling like a dick. Okay, that's how I want to improve the journey. But that lies outside the scope of measurement because the metrics are all about time, speed, and capacity. And that's the kind of thing which I mean, which is that taking Einstein never said, by the way, apparently, Einstein never said not everything that counts can be counted and not everything that can be counted counts. But it's not a dumb thing to say, nonetheless, that what we tend to do is optimize for those things that are just easy to quantify. Great, by the way, that's not generally a waste of time. It's a good idea that trains go at a reasonable speed and are reasonably punctual. But then what happens is my friend Guru Madhavan, who's a very brilliant engineer and author, he said, I hope I've got the order right, that a lot of these models, they start as a toy, then they become a tool, then they become a theory, and then they become a trap. And you can find yourself imprisoned, effectively, a prisoner of your own metrics. And you can see this happening not only with, say, the National Health Service. You can see this happening with all kinds of organisations. Earlier this year, I'm not sure the Grange at Cwmbran would not be your local hospital, would it? I doubt it. The Grange Hospital in Cwmbran. My father died there in earlier this year in March. Now, famously, the Welsh NHS, we always read about it here in England, is supposed to be very bad. Everything that happened in that hospital, from my father being admitted to ultimately dying there, was utterly magnificent. Okay, I'd just like to say that. To a point where if someone had offered me a free kind of hyperspace transfer to the Mayo Clinic in Cincinnati or, Bethesda Naval Hospital in the US, I would have said, no, there's no point because we have absolutely everything here and it's glorious. Now, as you all know, Welsh people are slightly nicer than other people. I think that's broadly speaking true. Kingsley Amis, no uncritical fan of the Welsh, always said that if he were ill or elderly, he'd like to be looked after by someone Welsh. Okay, and this was indeed what happened in this hospital. But it suddenly occurred to me afterwards that none of the things, not a single one of the things that made that an extraordinarily good, or at least as not bad as someone dying can be. He was 93, it was very largely painless, it was very rapid. But none of the things that made that an extraordinary experience could appear on a spreadsheet. They weren't things you could actually measure or quantify or formularize. There were things like there were some volunteers who'd created a garden next to the hospital. Very, very lovely garden in what had been, I think, the grounds of the original hospital. They'd campaigned for it not to be turned into a car park. It was a very, very lovely garden where if you were suffering bereavement or if you had a family member who was ill, that garden was actually, priceless in many ways. The general sort of willingness to make tea and the general charm of the people, every single person we encountered. You can't really quantify charm adequately. And so this nonsense of only optimizing for what you can quantify is, it's not a totally dumb. I'm not suggesting it's a totally dumb start, but I'm not suggesting the hospital would have been great if it had been run by total incompetence, but had still had a nice garden. Okay, but at the same time, there comes a point. I think there's an inflection point in any kind of optimization formula where what you need is not more optimization; it's actually a new formula. And another example would be hyper competition in academia, for example. It looks very meritocratic, but actually I would argue that certain places like Oxbridge might have been ruined by the intensity of competition to get in. Michael Sandel at Harvard refers to his students as wounded winners, that the price they've paid to get to where they got to arguably wasn't worth paying for the resulting prize, or at least, the hyper competition is just hugely damaging. And I think it can actually lead, those kind of things can lead to a form of insanity. To be honest, I went to Oxbridge myself in a much less competitive era. There were quite a lot of people there who, in a purely meritocratic world, maybe even including me, to be honest, didn't really deserve to be there. But it was disproportionately actually those people who made the experience really memorable and valuable, because there was, a cross-section of people from deeply committed academics to let's face it, people who are out for a bit of a laugh. And I'm not suggesting you wanted all one or all the other, but the mixture of the two made the experience worthwhile. You know, the most serious academics weren't much fun to be. The one exception being mathematicians, I would argue, where there's a genuine talent there. It's just innate. If you're good at maths, you can do it in 2 hours and you've got the rest of the day to yourself. If you can't do the maths, you can't do the maths. But other things which are much more kind of effort related, you know, generally it was the slight dilettantes you know, and the slightly fun-loving people who contributed, I think, disproportionately to the experience. You want people who actually are, you know, staging a play rather than writing an essay.
So if we begin to take some of these principles and layer them into these challenges, I think it would be silly to start anywhere other than diets, right? Because we all know endless people who have tried diets and they haven't worked. And unless Ozempic is truly going to come along and save us all and mean that we don't really need to have this conversation, I think that there is a conversation to be had about how can we make people actually stick to diets, right? So using the behavioural science knowledge that we have, how can we design a diet that has the highest possible compliance?
That's a tough one. I'm not a great advertisement, as you can see, for dietary adherence. I think I get certain things right. I have relatively low blood pressure, for example. Which I do measure quite assiduously. Pretty reasonable cholesterol. You know, I also exercise reasonably. One thing I did discover, by the way, is I quite like weight stuff. And I don't really like, I like walking, but I don't really like jogging, and I'm not sure I'm ever going to like it. Okay? I think there's a large swathe of the population who just basically will never enjoy that shit, by the way. Probably more women than men as well, I would argue. If you know, it's not a major gender thing, but I think you'll find there's a certain percentage of people who don't like it. With the dietary question, Ozempic, I can see being fairly extraordinary because it seems to have, it's not purely a physiological response, it's a psychological one where fascinatingly they've noticed that people on Ozempic, it may actually protect against things like not only binge eating, but binge drinking and even, according to some research I've seen, compulsive gambling. So it seems to have some bizarre response, which is kind of neuroendocrinological, if I've got that right. You know, in other words, it's not just an endocrinological thing. It's actually, there's some effect on the brain. And there's fascinating data emerging because in the US, for example, Walmart has its own chain of pharmacies and they have a loyalty card. So you can see how the people who've been prescribed, say, Wegovy or Ozempic shop differently. And for the snack food and kind of impulse eating part of the market, the effects seem quite pronounced, to a point where Goldman Sachs, I think, sort of wrote a paper on, you know, those industries that were most threatened by widespread availability of Ozempic or Wegovy or whatever. That's interesting because the self-control question is undoubtedly important. There is a philosophical question, which is that there's a very good writer on happiness called Paul Dolan, who's a professor of behavioural science at the London School of Economics. And he would make the point that the extent to which you optimise for current self-denial for future gain versus living entirely for the present, there is a balance there. There's a balance to be struck. Okay, there are people, very interesting, we talk about people routinely who are what you might call spendthrifts. They spend more than they earn, they get into debt, okay, they have all kinds of, you know, resulting financial problems. Those people, according to research done by George Lowenstein, seem to be about sort of 20% of the population. There's actually a larger percentage of the population, about 30%, whom Lowenstein calls skinflints, who actually spend too little. Okay, and so in pure economic terms, they find the practice of parting with money so painful that they actually reduce the utility they enjoy by basically buying too few things. You know, in other words, they're too reluctant to go on holiday, they're too reluctant to go to the pub, they're too reluctant to buy a sofa, they're too reluctant to buy a flat screen TV, in that even though those things would give them net pleasure, they find the pain of payment so acute that they basically underspend. And those people actually often, the old phrase, they end up as the richest corpse in the graveyard. And the same thing, I think, has to be applied to other things. I probably, in terms of I've been very lucky in one respect, in that I've never had, I've had a pretty unhealthy relationship with nicotine, which to some extent I've managed to head off at the pass via vaping, which I would agree is suboptimal, but a hell of a lot better than the alternative. You've got to remember that the perfect is often the enemy of the good in that respect. I've never had a problem with alcohol, in that I enjoy it, but basically under most circumstances I can take it or leave it. It's very, very rare that I get home and go, I need a drink, or anything of that kind. I've lucked out there, particularly given the job I do. It's not all that uncommon for people, if not to become alcoholic, to develop a kind of unhealthy dependency. I've probably had a crap relationship with food, in that I'm just a little, to be honest, a lot of it is curiosity. I'll be, in that I have a very varied diet, probably quite a good thing in some respects, but I can't resist trying things or combinations or whatever. I'm a sort of sensation seeker, and so I failed on that score. I'm slightly getting better at it. I'm also one thing I discovered, as I said, is I don't like jogging, but I quite like doing sort of weights, press-ups, actually, musculoskeletal stuff. That's a useful discovery, that I actually don't mind doing that stuff at all. And I'm lucky enough to live on the second floor of a building with no lift, so I'm kind of forced to actually at least, attain reasonable mobility, and effectively preserve that. But the food thing is complicated, because we've got to remember, I slightly worry about. I've had teenage daughters. Both of them got through that period, fairly well. With no, I don't think either of them ever had an eating disorder. There's a little bit of me which goes, shit, mate. I'm 58. I've got to worry about this shit, right? Okay. I'm going through, I think, what's occasionally called Death Valley, which is that period from kind of 55 to 65 or whatever it is, where if you get through it, your odds actually improve quite a bit. Your longevity actually improves. But it's a sort of sniper alley, it's sometimes called as well. You've probably heard that phrase. But there's a bit of me which goes, Jesus, you're 23 years old. You're worrying about your complexion, for crying out loud. You're worried about makeup. You're worried about contouring. When I was a kid, never mind blokes, girls didn't worry about that stuff that much. They did a bit, but not to the extent of having 13-year-olds who are kind of discussing NARS cosmetics. This isn't. And so let me explain this phenomenon which I mentioned, which is that an awful lot of new things, when we improve them, we think this is great. And then, when that improvement becomes more universal, it simply raises the standard. So, for example, okay, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. A lot of homes, even rich people's homes, the interiors were kind of shit, right? There was paint peeling off the wall. One of the sofas was a bit stained. Everybody smoked, so that, the walls were slightly yellow. You had a log fire, so there was, general staining on things. They were just, a bit grubby. You now look at Airbnb, everything's a fucking show home, right? But what about the people who don't want to live in a show home? There are a hell of a lot of people who just want to, basically, they want to live in a place where you can put your feet on the furniture. They want to live in a place where you don't have to take your shoes off when you go in. They want to go in a place where the table's covered in kind of shit and magazines, and there are books piled up on the, on the sideboard. Okay. Those people actually aren't really allowed to live like that anymore. I mean, seriously, if you took aristocratic homes from the 1970s and you photographed them and you showed someone living there today, people would call social services. Now, in many ways, for many people, this is all great, okay? But it's setting an impossibly high bar for people. Now, I'll tell you what happened with the washing machine. Of all the things that was pretty damn good news, the washing machine as an invention was pretty good. I mean, women would previously, it was tended to be women, obviously. You know, one of the arguments is that the washing machine partly allowed women to enter the workforce. You no longer had to spend one day every week doing laundry. Bingo, big win. You no longer have to do that because the washing machine combined with the spin dryer, you know, tumble dryer comes later. That does everything for you basically in one go, and while you're getting on with something else. But the downside was that standards of domestic and personal hygiene rose to actually absorb the gain in time saving. So instead of people going, well, I can be just as slightly smelly as I was before, and I mean, this was not uncommon in the 1960s, okay? You'd keep your shirt from one day to the next, but just change the collar, right? So you launder collars and you'd use one collar, okay, multiple collars with one shirt, you know, and to be absolutely honest, you know, people probably stank a bit. That was one thing when they actually put out Downton Abbey. They interviewed very, very elderly aristos from the period. And one of their comments was something that Downton doesn't get across is that at the time, everybody, but particularly the servants, basically stank. Okay? Now, you just accepted that then. It's now only people who are practically destitute who would actually have any real discernible strong body odour. And so what we do is we go, wow, there's a wonderful time saving. We're now free to write poetry, you know, start a band and do wonderful things with all the time that technology has suddenly gifted to us. But we don't. What happens is the bar, what you might call the socially acceptable bar for fabric cleanliness or bodily hygiene, then just gets raised to effectively mop up the gain. In the same way, by the way, and this is another obsession of mine, which is that most of the work done by free market capitalism in getting people better goods at a lower price with an extraordinary range of choice. You know, if you go into a modern day, what have you got? You haven't got a Sainsbury's and Pontypridd, have you? What have you got? You've got a Tesco, have you?
Yeah, no, that's the Sainsbury's is the main supermarket here.
And it's weird because Sainsbury's didn't come to Wales until the 1980s. They were absolutely, I think Newport was the first one. Sorry, your listeners don't want to know about Welsh retailing history. I'm going off on one there. But if you go into that Sainsbury's in Pontypridd, to my grandfather, it would seem like just unrecognisable abundance. Okay? You know, your flat screen TV to my grandfather, he was a Tredegar doctor, died in the 1950s. He would have thought it was a miracle, okay? Now, most of the gains that have been delivered through what you might call competitive production and supply of goods, to a lesser extent services, but particularly goods, have been just mopped up in higher property prices. They haven't actually said, well, that's brilliant because I can buy all this shit I need for not very much, so now I have more money to have a hot tub, a jet ski or a holiday in the Bahamas. Instead, what's happened is that property prices have simply risen as a kind of sump to soak up the discretionary spending that would otherwise have been able to go on more goods and services. And in the same way, I think what tends to happen is we have these, whenever you have a product or good for which competition is rivalrous, okay? In other words, it's principally what you might call a positional good or a comparative good. You have a problem, okay? Broadly speaking, with televisions, we've reached a point where you could argue they basically have basic utility. I've got a 55-inch flat screen TV. I could replace it. I can't be bothered. I suppose I could get a 95-inch TV and kind of get one up on my neighbour, but nobody really bothers. We're kind of happy with the TVs we've got. So what then happens is instead of more money going into other fun things like that, it gets soaked up into those things which are highly comparative. And those would include education, for example, which is effectively rivalrously consumed. Property is effectively a good where it's again rivalrously consumed. And so those rivalrous and unhealthy comparative parts of the economy, which I don't think deliver that much happiness because generally the pleasure you derive is not from the ownership of the thing, it's from the fact that the thing is better than your neighbour's thing. Okay, those things becoming true of probably high fashion goods, LVMH. Okay, those rivalrous goods soak up more and more of our discretionary income, and the things that are genuinely inarguable goods, which are highly democratic, by the way. I mean, what have you got? An iPhone 16?
I'm still on the 13. I'm trying to be sensible and stay low.
You're still on the 13. Okay, very sensible. Okay. But you could go and buy an iPhone 16. You'd have the same phone as Elon Musk, right? You'd have the same phone as Jeff Bezos. That's pretty weird, okay? In the scheme of things, there weren't many French, random French people who had kind of the same carriage as Louis XIV, okay? PlayStations, PS5, whatever. Those things are actually extraordinary democratic goods. That basically, someone on median income can afford the same thing as someone who is insanely rich. And okay, the person who's insanely rich could buy one that's studded in diamonds or whatever, but they probably won't. Okay? There's no gain. I mean, there are those blingy brands of television like sort of Loewe and Bang & Olufsen, which are probably 5% better in some respect. But again, most people don't bother, right? So you have these incredibly egalitarian goods where, in a way we can almost reach what my daughter, I think, calls, post-scarcity luxury communism, where everybody owns pretty good things. Okay. Then you have the rivalrous economy where people are focusing on comparison and optimization or relative measures. And the problem with those things is, to put it bluntly, it never fucking ends. It's a Fisherian runaway, the peacock's tail, those things where I can't help. Okay, there's a bit of me which just goes, right. I shouldn't really say this, but back in the 1950s, 1960s, football was partly about fitness, but it was a lot about talent. Okay, and there were people like Puskás, Hungarian player in the 50s, Socrates, right, 1970s Brazil team, comes off the pitch, lights a cigarette at half time. Right? He was a doctor as well. Okay, these were people who were they were fittish, right? Okay, but they were just unbelievably talented. And now what happens is the fitness becomes a precondition. And so arguably football is a game with fitter players, but with no room for the Gascoignes or the Puskás's, who are just people who aren't that fit but are really, really talented. Now, are we richer for that, or are we poorer? I don't know. Okay, I always tell the story about... So this is what I mean about hyper-competition, when things effectively become, essentially... I want sport to be a battle for talent, not a battle for kind of extremist regimes. And if you look at cycling, what happened there? Eventually, the only way you can win is effectively by having a blood transfusion before you get on a bike or something. All right. So those areas of what you might call there's creative competition, which is often highly lateral. It's inventive. It's someone when everybody else zigs, you zag. Okay. It's incredibly inventive. It leads to spectacular feats of human ingenuity. And then there's what you might call side-by-side endless comparison. And we tend to use the word competition to refer to both of these manifestations. But they're actually completely different. One of them is, I think, highly beneficial. And the other one is ultimately, it's a negative sum game.
So I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit because based on where this conversation's gone, there's a quote of yours from the other day on Twitter, which I think, because I know you have a hard stop, is a perfect place for us to round this out, right? So rather than going through more examples, it feels like a theme of today's conversation has been the idea that optimization for optimization's sake is this thing which we all get lost in, certainly in my generation, and we forget to live right. So I think something you tweeted the other day, though it feels unrelated, is somewhat analogous. You tweeted, serious sounding questions aren't necessarily important and trivial questions aren't necessarily silly. So how do we align ourselves with living a better life by actually living in the moment, right? Rather than kind of getting distracted by these numbers and these shiny things and these ideas of improvement for improvement's sake.
My point there is that life's kind of fractal, and I think for reasons of status, people love to talk in the language of things like economics, which are highfalutin. Gosh, don't I sound important? I'm talking about the Federal Reserve kind of bollocks, okay? But actually, if you really want to understand life, it's kind of fractal. in that the same patterns recur at, the really important patterns recur at different scales. And I'll give you an example. If you read Nassim Taleb, I venerate old Nassim, but if you read his book, for example, Anti-Fragile, there was a whole section on it where I was mildly useful because he was talking about a concept called minority rule, which is where if you get a small group of people who effectively boycott something, and another group of people who are indifferent, okay, the minority group has a surprising amount of power. It's why you can't really run a restaurant without a vegetarian option, because out of a party of 8, one vegetarian or 2 vegetarians are going to go, I'm not going to the steakhouse, there's nothing for me to eat there. And the people who like eating steak go, well, fair enough, let's compromise and we'll have pizza. And I made exactly this point about pizza to Nassim, which is that it's in some ways the world's most dominant snack food because nobody hates it. It's not because we all love it, it's because basically you can serve it to everyone and people can share it out and you can have hotter and milder variants. In other words, it's not the actual fact that everybody loves it, it's the fact that nobody hates it. It was always famously said that Budweiser was the best-selling beer in America because it was everybody's second favourite beer. So in other words, you had some friends round to watch some Super Bowl or whatever. You got 8 bottles of Coors for yourself, and then you got Budweiser for everybody else because nobody would reject it. Okay, it alienated no one. And so understanding, I think, these kind of forces, if you want, I spend a lot of time talking about transport because transport is an interesting, salient and comprehensible way to talk about complex systems and psychology in a field where everybody recognizes it. Everybody basically knows what it's like to feel frustrated waiting for a taxi or a train or a plane. Everybody knows how annoying it is to have to queue at some times, but where at other times queuing isn't annoying at all. And you can therefore, take trivial everyday human experience and if you're clever, you can generalize it up. Whereas what I think a lot of academic disciplines do is they start at the top, they start with a grand theory, and then try and apply it down. And I think genuinely that's the wrong way to approach it. The reason that tweet appeared, by the way, is someone asked the question, I think the idea of meeting someone really distinguished and asking really trivial questions. You meet Neil Armstrong and you ask him, does he put the lavatory roll on with the paper hanging away from the wall or close to the wall? You know what I mean? And I actually made the point that I'd once spent, I think, 25 minutes talking to the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman about a speed camera on the M11 near Chingford. And then I made the point that this wasn't entirely gratuitous. He'd written a book about noise, co-written it with, I think, Cass Sunstein. And I made the point that when you look at data from a speed camera, and the speed camera was one of the most profitable in the country, by the way, there are 2 possible interpretations. The speed camera needs to be there because there are a lot of very dangerous drivers going past that speed camera. But the other interpretation is actually, maybe it's not the table that's too big, it's the ruler that's too small, and that actually the reason the speed camera catches so many people is because the speed limit is unreasonable, it's inadequately signed, or the speed camera is positioned at a place where it gives too little time for motorists to slow down from, it's the M11, so bluntly speaking, they come over a hill and they're forced to slow down from, let's be realistic, 75, 80 to 50 in the space of about 500 yards. Now, the legal thing to do there is actually a dangerous thing to do. The reason people are actually getting done by that speed camera is they're instinctively reluctant to obey the law because the law is requiring to do something which in motoring terms is ill-advised, which is suddenly slam on the anchors and decelerate by 30 miles an hour in a very short distance with a risk of getting rear-ended from behind. So I said, you can look at that data and say that's a noisy speed camera. Maybe that speed camera is in exactly the right place and it's doing great duty. Maybe, actually, the very high rate of fines that result from that thing effectively mean it shouldn't be where it is, or you need to revamp your signage, or you need a prior thing to slow people down to 60, okay, before you hit the 50 limit. And I think this is a thing that's sometimes called Wittgenstein's ruler. In other words, are you using the ruler to measure the table, or are you measuring the table to measure the ruler? And so, actually, the discussion of trivial things someone criticised the advertising industry. I thought it was actually rather a good criticism. They said, you advertising people, you go very deeply into the surface of things, don't you? And yeah, we do. I admit that. And sometimes it is absolutely daft, okay, and it results in utterly ridiculous products, advertising, etc. But there's a surprising value, actually, to going deep into trivia and finding a pattern at small scale and seeing if you can generalize it, rather than doing what most people do, which is generalizing for the average, okay, at a large scale, and then imposing it downwards, which I think is what economics does to a large extent. I think the appalling failure of economics, of course, is that if you optimize for the average, if you have what's called a single representative agent model in economics, you can't understand wealth inequality, for example. Okay, because you can't have inequality when you have a single average agent. And so what I think an awful lot of economics did over the last 30 years is it increased average wealth, but the price you paid, one, it wasn't necessarily GDP per capita, it was simply growing GDP. But secondly, actually what I think it did is it increased overall wealth at the expense of reasonably manageable income and wealth inequality, particularly wealth inequality, actually, which is much, much more severe and much, much more extreme than income inequality.
I'd just love to hear your thoughts on the topic of Wales, on the topic of speed limits, on the topic of things changing too soon. The 20-mile-an-hour limit in Wales, there's this really fascinating thing, at least anecdotally, which has happened. So there is now a blanket 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in everywhere, which was a 30-mile-an-hour.
They've got rid of it, haven't they?
Still in place. It looks like they're going to shift it under the leadership of this new First Minister. But what's interesting, what's happened from a psychology perspective, it's not that everybody slowed down to 20 because nobody has. It's the 20s, which were there for a safety reason, have lost that safety blanket, because now, unless you happen to know there's a school that you're about to drive past, everyone's whizzing past the previous 20s at 30 and doing 30 everywhere elsewhere anyway. So it's this really interesting psychology where you switch something too soon, people don't buy in, and actually the entire thing is disregarded.
Well, one interesting thing, of course, if you optimize for speed, as I said, going from 30 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour makes a huge difference to your arrival time. Going from 60 miles an hour to 90 miles an hour doesn't that much. Let's assume you're traveling, 20 or 30 miles. You'll have noticed this, by the way. Once you're travelling at 65, 70 miles an hour on a motorway, you look at your sat-nav. If you welly it at 85, after about 5 or 6 minutes, your arrival time drops by 1 minute. Okay, not worth doing. It's a mug's game. Okay, genuinely. Okay. However, forcing people to travel at 20 rather than 30 is problematic. One, when people travel at 30, it's kind of the maximum density of traffic passing a given point because the cars can travel close together. I would, by the way, why did it have to be a multiple of 10? Okay, this is totally arbitrary. In kilometres per hour, what we would have done is probably reduce the speed limit by 10 kilometres per hour rather than miles per hour. And I would say that 25 is kind of okay. Okay, but at 20, literally, in a modern car, it feels like being stationary. It massively adds to the time cars spend on the road, so it may actually cause congestion, because now actually you will literally, your journey at 20 miles an hour will take inordinately longer than the journey performed at 30 miles an hour. Not the same if you 60 versus 70 doesn't really affect the time cars spend on the road. Okay, 20 versus 30 does. So now you're going to be increasing congestion with possible environmental costs of that. Okay, a lot of cars, I'm okay, I wasn't that bothered. I had an electric car. Electric cars drive pretty happily at any speed. A lot of cars aren't really happy driving at 20 miles an hour. Okay, there isn't a gear really designed for that. A lot of automatics find it, they're kind of halfway between two gears. 30 miles, cars have been optimized to basically rumble along at 30 quite well. 25 would have been okay, I think. And as you say, you could then reserve 20 rather than crying wolf and going, oh my God, we're driving through a town with absolutely no pedestrians at 3 o'clock in the morning, okay, where frankly there hasn't been a road accident in 50 years, but we still have to drive at a crawl. Okay, you could reserve 20 for near schools, black spots, places where there had, and then it would actually have a forceful, rather than crying wolf, it would have a forceful message. I think you're absolutely right about that. That actually it was too indiscriminate. I mean, an awful lot of this stuff is a problem really of insufficient discrimination. In other words, legislation has to be top down, it has to generalize, and ultimately, I mean, why couldn't someone actually make a judgment call about that? Why couldn't someone say, okay, we'll keep it at 30 in certain places where, let's face it, it's kind of fine. We'll have a 25 limit for certain places. I wouldn't totally dispute that. Not a bad idea. Increasingly, modern cars also recognise the speed limit and so will actually notify you. That's quite handy. But for all kinds of reasons, it was too crude a decision, straight from 30 to 20. If you'd had a 50 kilometre an hour speed limit or a 60 kilometre an hour limit, people would have dropped that by 10, I think. And I think 20 miles an hour is, in many situations, so comically slow that it effectively becomes unsustainable as a blanket measure. So what do you think the reversal is going to be?
So I think that they're going to just apply a little bit more pragmatism, in so much as there's a road right by my house, for example, which used to be a 40 when I moved to Wales. It then got dropped to a 30, and then because of the blanket change to 30, it's now a 20. 0 people are doing 20 miles an hour on that road. So I think that they've made the blanket change, and then hopefully, dare I say, they're going to now reverse it pragmatically on a road by road basis based on, I assume, the input of local authorities or the highways agency or somebody who knows their stuff right. But it does not work functionally.
I mean, the French have some quite clever things, which is you could have different speed limits day and night. I mean, one of the absurd things is that the A13 in London has a 40 and 50 limit for a large part of its stretch before the M25, which is largely designed to minimise congestion, actually, which is that slower moving cars, when cars are moving slower, you get more cars past a given point in any given period of time than when they're moving fast because of the gap they have to leave in between them when they're going faster. 30 to 30, you're not quite going bumper to bumper, but it's a pretty high density of traffic, okay? And it's a very efficient way of basically getting cars out of the capital. Does that limit really need to pertain? It's a dual carriageway, okay? There are no pedestrians. Does that limit really have to pertain at 11 o'clock at night? Okay? I've often wondered mischievously whether you should actually lift the motorway speed limit to like 85 between like 11 o'clock and 1 in the morning to encourage people to travel later, Similarly, the French have a pretty sensible arrangement where the motorway speed limit reduces by 20 km/h in the rain. So you actually get 110/130 in an image of a rain cloud. And so they have a different speed limit for motorways in the rain than they do in the dry, which seems eminently sensible because visibility is worse, braking distance is worse, everything's worse. And that, that's always struck me as a pretty smart thing. One of the things we're not very good at is you could literally have a ministry of nicking ideas in the UK, where you simply potter around the world and you go, that's pretty smart. I mean, for example, having different rules requiring people who've just passed their driving test to display some sort of thing on their car, not least to inform other motorists that they may not be the sharpest tool in the box when it comes to manoeuvring or whatever. But also having rules like you can't. I think there was one thing is basically you couldn't drive groups of people around after you just passed your driving test because general sort of male bravado in particular led to that, and insurance companies will tell you this, led to that being an extraordinary source of kind of injury, foolishness, and just general car crashes. And so, actually just wandering around the world and saying, actually, what the Dutch are doing here seems pretty smart. What do we have to do for micro-mobility, which I think is, I think the electric bike is a very interesting idea. And, how can we encourage certain behaviours? One thing I'd be in favour of, by the way, and there's a paper from someone at I think it's the University of West of England combined with the University of Leeds, if I got this right, 2 places which are very, very good on transport. They argue that, look, if you want to actually reduce carbon emissions from transportation, okay, if you ask people to abandon a car to take a bicycle, or whatever it may be, okay, in order for them to take a significant amount of carbon out of the atmosphere, you've got to change their behaviour like 200 times a year. And some of the time their behaviour is not even changeable, because if it's raining, you've got luggage, you've got passengers. There are loads of occasions where you can't substitute a bike journey for a car journey, or you live somewhere really hilly. Okay, it's actually fascinating. I was in Usk, and there were these two people in their 70s who'd cycled down from the valleys. I was like completely... and then I realised they had electric bikes. So basically they had a nice cycle ride down to Usk and they had a tolerable cycle ride back. Whereas, if you lived in the Welsh Valleys, a large part of it would be intolerable for anybody other than Lance Armstrong, those technologies are really interesting. But what I was saying is that actually, what I would do is I would tax quite heavily any journey by air where you're not out of the country, or at least you're not making a journey where you're staying away for 5 nights or more. Okay? And the argument there is, those short business trips are substitutable by Zoom, to be honest. Okay? In fact, a lot of the people who are forced to make those business trips will be much, much happier not making them. They're not really very much fun. Short weekend breaks, I'm sorry, I think they're kind of dumb. Okay? Of all the uses of air travel, go to another country, talk to the people, use their shops, ride in their taxis. Don't just go and look at the fucking Mona Lisa and the Eiffel Tower and then go back again. Don't go to Prague and just go to, a bar, a strip club and an art museum and then go back in. First of all, those city breaks are driving this terrible destruction of tourist sites, because everybody with 3 days to spare is going to go and see the same 3 bloody things, right? If you've got 5, 6, 7 days, you start discovering other random shit. If you've only got 2 days, you basically do the obvious tourist stuff, which is actually destroying the value of those places anyway. You can't get within 200 yards of the Mona Lisa. Selfie sticks all the way. And so actually banging a heavy tax, both on business travellers and leisure travellers, for journeys where you're not really travelling, you're basically taking what is a short, symbolic, probably for showing off purposes, trip. I'd be pretty much in favour of that. Now, that doesn't require people to change their behaviour very much, but it would reduce carbon by a huge amount. Getting people to replace a car journey with a bike journey is the opposite. It doesn't remove that much carbon, but it demands a huge amount of often unfeasible behavioural change. So I thought that paper was very, very interesting. I thought it was very worthwhile. Instead of just going, how do we reduce carbon across the board? It says, how do we reduce carbon emissions in a way that requires people to change their behaviour to the least extent? That seemed bloody smart to me.
I'm so happy that we started this podcast thinking we would speak about self-improvement, and we've landed in the realm of 20 miles an hour in Wales. I've taken more time of yours than you agreed to, so I will let you go. But if people want to head somewhere to find you that isn't TikTok, where can they go?
Twitter is at Rory Sutherland. I'm on LinkedIn. Obviously, I'm on TikTok. I think it's Rory Sutherland Clips. Twitter's probably the best first place. I'm so sorry. I've got to go because my phone is ringing again.